may it be so. Healing is happening, may it be so. Healing is possible, may it be so. Healing is happening, may it be so. Our presentation is happening, may it be so.
All right, we're delighted to have our featured speaker for this convocation. I think Fern and I both got to know him at the GA last year, doing one of the theological motivations and explanations of things related to thinking about the Article 2 related to the eighth principle and changing, updating our descriptions of who we are. And I was impressed with his words then, and I look forward to hearing what he has to tell us. Please welcome Dan McKanan.
Thank you so much. It is really great fun to be here with all of you wonderful lovers of everything Universalist. There are so many twists and turns to the Universalist story and message, and it's great to share them with you. And I will just say as a little initial plug that if you have Sandy's quiz and are puzzling over some of those questions, you should pay attention to my talk because I will be alluding to some of the answers. Now, it's wonderful to be here, but I must confess that I hesitated when I received the invitation. I wasn't quite sure what I had to say. Now, in a lot of ways, I feel more affinity for the Universalist than the Unitarian side of our family tree. But I live and work in the Unitarian heartland. Harvard Divinity School, where I teach, was created by the same people who created the Unitarian denomination in the United States. I've been thinking a lot about those people lately, because Harvard Divinity School has spent the last year studying Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, a comprehensive report on our university's entanglement with the enslavement of African people and its aftermath. Reading that report and following its many threads has taught me a lot about Unitarians. I already knew that many of the congregations that became Unitarian in the 19th century had included slave owners and enslaved people in the 17th and 18th centuries. But I hadn't realized the deep family ties that connected 19th century Unitarian leaders to the international slave trade, even after slavery had been abolished in Massachusetts and other northern states. It turns out Unitarians like William Ellery Channing, even many who personally hated slavery, were more entangled with it than other white people of their generation, including white people in the South. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the moral injury that Channing and other Unitarian founders must have experienced as a result of their dependence on wealth gained from the slave trade. So when I got this invitation, I thought it might be interesting to trace similar stories on the Universalist side of our family tree. Turns out it wasn't so easy. Though some Universalists had stories similar to Channing's, most did not. The Universalist story, by and large, has different lessons to teach us about how to grapple with legacies of oppression, different dimensions of the story to develop. So today I'll mostly be telling stories connected with Philadelphia and with this congregation. But in order to get at them, and in light of the work that this congregation has been doing on reparation, I'd like to first share a little bit about what I've learned about Channing. So I apologize for this Unitarian beginning to my Universalist talk. Channing was the most admired and influential among the founders of the American Unitarian Association. and among the most admired and influential of the founders of Harvard Divinity School. And he was a strong opponent of slavery. But he was also a child of Newport, Rhode Island, one of the most important ports in the triangular trade that connected Europe, North America, Africa, and the Caribbean. His great-grandfather was a slave trader who kidnapped children in Africa and traded them for New England rum in Boston Harbor, just a few years before Channing was born. Channing's father-in-law was a merchant who supplied the New England-produced goods that were traded on slave ships. Others in Channing's family were ambivalent about slavery, working for its abolition while continuing to benefit from it. As a baby, Channing was cared for by Duchess Cormino, a woman who had been enslaved by his parents, but was allowed to purchase her freedom while continuing to work for the family. Channing eventually wrote the epitaph on her tombstone, which you see here. Channing's childhood pastor, Ezra Stiles, served as president of an abolition society while simultaneously claiming an African man as his property. As pastor of Boston's Federal Street Church, Channing continued to benefit financially from the slave trade. The wealthiest member of his congregation, Thomas Henderson Perkins, and his brothers, whom you see here, had made their fortune selling slaves in Haiti on the eve of the Haitian Revolution. Two of Channing's brothers were married to members of the Perkins family, cementing an intimate tie between the families. The Perkinses were among the slave-trading Unitarian families that gave a large share of Harvard's endowment gifts during the 19th century. That means that I, as a member of Harvard's faculty, still experience some of the same moral injury that Channing did. My livelihood depends on the lives and labor stolen from people of African descent 200 years ago. In fact, the typically Unitarian experience of moral injury leads us directly to a conversation about reparations. If we've benefited from the suffering of others, even if we weren't the ones who chose to inflict that suffering, then it's not enough to pat ourselves on the back with acts of charity or benevolence. We need to find a way to transfer wealth, both personal wealth and the wealth of institutions, to the people whose suffering made that wealth possible. If you attend a church with a significant endowment, or a building that was paid for generations ago, you would do well to look at the sources of the wealth that made that possible. Perhaps it was enslavement, perhaps land theft, perhaps fossil fuels, perhaps a mix of all of those. And if you or your children attend a school or university with an endowment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars per student, you definitely need to be part of that school's conversation about reparations. But the reparation conversation is not the only conversation we need to be having. Reparations begin when we recognize how we've benefited from other people's suffering. But most of us have also suffered from social injustice, and that provides another starting point. We can connect our suffering to the suffering of others and begin working together for a world with less suffering. For the most part, that has been the Universalist path to social justice. And it's a path that needs more attention in Unitarian Universalism today. I say for the most part because some early Universalists were entangled in slavery in pretty much the same way that William Ellery Channing was. This was so, for example, for the founding family, in some accounts, of American Universalism, the Sargents of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Gloucester was a prominent port that participated in the triangular trade. In fact, Channing's great-grandfather got started in Gloucester before moving on to Newport. Winthrop Sargent, who founded the first specifically Unitarian Universalist congregation in North America, was a child of Gloucester's wealthiest family. and his children continued to participate in enslavement well into the 19th century. Around the same time that Winthrop Sargent's daughter Judith married the English immigrant preacher John Murray, and you can see Judith on the screen, Winthrop's son, Fitzwilliam, was investing in slave ships. Another son, Winthrop Jr., the other person you see on the screen, established a slave plantation called Gloucester in Mississippi after serving as territorial governor there. If you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin, you might recall that the most violent slave owner in the book is a transplanted New Englander. This is the kind of story the Sargents were entangled in. Judith Sargent Murray herself spent her final years living on her brother's plantation. Still, the Sargents were not typical Universalists. In fact, most of their cousins became Unitarians. As regular participants in the Universalist Convocation, some of you probably know that Universalists typically didn't come from seafaring ports from Gloucester, but from the hill country of western New England, or from the German pietist communities of Pennsylvania. Most Universalists were working class, and here in Philadelphia, they helped organize some of the nation's first labor unions. When these people spoke out against slavery, it was often because they worried that they themselves would eventually be enslaved if merchants, factory owners, and other capitalists continued to consolidate social power. At its best, the resulting approach to social change was one of radical solidarity. While Unitarians hoped to help oppressed classes whom they regarded as very different from themselves, Universalists hoped to widen their circle of concern to include all of humanity. Of course, Universalists were not always at their best. When we start from our own suffering, we can become self-centered, regarding our complaints as more important than those of other people. That can cause us to backslide from early expressions of inclusive commitment. That's what often happened for Universalism. Though Universalists were one of the first denominations to condemn slavery, this didn't translate into consistent action on the part of the Universalist movement. Instead, Universalists often participated in political movements, such as the Jacksonian Democrats, that made fatal compromises with slavery. Philadelphia was one place where this happened. And so I'd like to highlight two Philadelphia stories of backsliding. One that you might already know, and one that you might not. So, who knows? The first backsliding story begins with the Universalist Convocation of 1790. Since this was the first ostensibly national gathering of Universalists, we often cite it as the founding moment of the denomination. You may be familiar with the Articles of Faith and Plan of Church Government that was produced on that occasion. It was short on doctrine and long on social justice. The Articles of Faith were few and simple. The paragraph on sacraments was long because it takes a long time to say, you can do it any way you want. But the document concluded with very specific recommendations about how to live in the world. Universalists were encouraged to refrain from war-making, from suing their neighbors, from taking oaths, and above all, from holding slaves. That last recommendation was a direct corollary of Universalist theology. We believe it to be inconsistent with the union of the human race in a common Savior to hold any part of our fellow creatures in bondage. Now, you can see from the full text of this recommendation that it contains some wiggle room. It was a recommendation, not a requirement, and even as such, it fell short of the abolitionist standard of total emancipation. But it was an encouraging starting point. Unfortunately, it was in many ways an end point for denomination-wide discussion of racial justice. When Universalists gathered again to craft the more influential Winchester Profession, there was no corresponding section. And much later, when Universalist abolitionists tried to get their denomination to take a united stand against slavery, The great theologian Hosea Ballou was one of those who said no. His reason was that spreading Universalist values was the most important thing, and that controversial issues shouldn't get in the way. Another 100 years later, Universalist social gospelers began pointing back to the 1790 document as evidence that Universalists always drew a direct connection between God's universal love for humanity and perfect human equality here on earth. But the truth was always more complicated. The complications show up in my other backsliding story from the 1840s and from this congregation, more or less. Since this involves this congregation, I'm curious, how many of you here are familiar with the name of Charles Chauncey Burr? Okay, we got a couple. Good. As far as I've been able to determine, Charles Chauncey Burr was not closely related to Vice President Aaron Burr. Nor was he named after Charles Chauncey, the proto-Unitarian pastor of First Church in Boston, a congregation about as different from this one as a church could be. But Charles Chauncey Burr was a minister of this church, then known as the Second Independent Church of Christ, called Universalist of the Northern Liberties, for 3 years from 1845 to 1847. By 19th century Universalist standards, 1845 to 1847 was a pretty long pastorate, but it wasn't entirely successful. I should have pointed this forward. According to the Universalist History written by Perce Gable in 1945, Burr was an orator and attracted large audience, but he was not a pastor in the strict sense. When Burr left the ministry, he turned to journalism. As editor of a short-lived paper called The 19th Century, Burr convened a conversation among the most radical voices in Philadelphia and in Universalism. Burr's magazine embodied a distinctly Universalist approach to social justice that we would do well to honor and remember. Yet within 2 decades, his political allegiances shifted from radical to reactionary. I'll say more about that later, but first we're going to stick for a moment in 1848. In the magazine's first issue, Burr promised to provide his readers with an unfettered press that would represent our thoughts, our religion, our politics, our social feelings without crowding us into the channels of party. He promised further to feature the words of divine original men with strong hearts and free minds and fabulous illustrations, as you can see. Burr's words bristled with working-class resentment against the merchants and professionals who might have been found in Unitarian congregations of the day. The professions of the law, medicine, and divinity, he lamented, are resorted to everywhere by men graceless and ungifted, for the sole object of bread and clothes. The ambition of every father is not to make a man of his son, but a traitor. Against such trends, Burr promised to speak on behalf of the 9 millions of American craftsmen whose sweat and blood we are coining into gold. He promised to defend the working class from the twin dangers of sect and mammon, and he celebrated the rise of social reform societies doing this work. Prisoners' Friends Societies, social associations, national reformers, young Americans, and the fantastic troupe of beneficial societies. These are all evidence that people are awake to a sense of their dangers at last, that already they have guessed the remedy and go out everywhere seeking after love. I'm going to come back to that love at the end of the talk. It's worth dwelling on Burr's list of admirable associations because a Unitarian likely would have given a completely different list. It's significant he didn't include abolition societies. He also didn't include the abolitionists' rivals, the colonization societies that sought to end slavery by sending enslaved people to Africa. The abolitionists and the colonizationists alike appealed to wealthy people who felt guilty about the ways they benefited from enslavement. Many of their leading members were ministers. Burr's preferred organizations appealed to skilled craftsmen and other middle-income people who sought to protect themselves from the rising tide of plutocracy. The Young Americans were the most radical wing of the Democratic Party. The National Reformers sought to make federal lands in the West available to the urban poor. Beneficial societies pooled their income in order to provide assistance in times of family crisis. Burr also admired utopian socialist communities, one place where working-class radicals did make common cause with transcendentalist Unitarians. For the most part, though, Universalist radicals like Burr moved in different political circles than Unitarian radicals. One way to describe the difference is with a pair of terms that came into use at the turn of the 20th century. While Unitarian radicals were generally progressive, Burr and his friends were populist. Progressives value education and seek to shift social power to well-educated professionals, who in turn often express special concern for those at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. Populists value broad-based democracy and often view politics as a grand struggle between privileged elites and the people, with the people understood as those in the middle and bottom middle parts of the income distribution. Progressivism and populism need not be antithetical. Some of the most successful social movements draw on both styles, but they are different. The populist radicalism of the 19th century was evident in the contributions of Reverend Theophilus Fiske. Back in the 1820s, Fiske had been pastor of First Universalist downtown when his congregant, William Layton, called on Philadelphia's workers to create a citywide federation of unions. By the 1840s, Fiske was himself a labor organizer who denounced any preacher who refused to support the 10-hour day. In one article, Fiske pulled no punches in his assault on capitalism. The history of the producers of wealth, he wrote, is that of a continual warfare of honesty against fraud, weakness against power, justice against oppression. In the great battle of capital versus labor, he added, capital has too often had the government with its legions of bayonets to support its claims. Against those who said that professionals also perform labor, Fiske noted sarcastically that they were laboring to collect that which others have earned. He concluded by urging American workers to form their own political party, while also becoming co-workers with the Friends of Freedom throughout the world. In another article, he launched a populist attack on elite higher education. The study of Greek and Latin, he said, overemphasized memorization and glorified the violence of the people in the Homeric epics. We shall never be rescued from the trammels, bigotry, and pedantry of the Dark Ages, from the slavery and licentiousness of Latin and Greek, he wrote, until we are rescued from the domination of the clergy in education. He's talking about my employer there. Another flavor of Universalist radicalism appeared in the contribution of newspaperman Horace Greeley, along with P.T. Barnum, probably the most famous Universalist of his generation. One of his pieces endorsed the work of the National Reformers, who demanded that the federal government redistribute its land to the urban poor. Greeley extended this vision to encompass the whole world. Of the 1,000 million human beings who are now in existence, Greeley asked, what proportion practically enjoy the right to any soil except that which with their lifeless bodies are finally covered? Though Greeley didn't use the word reparation, he envisioned a reparative response to the evils of land speculation, suggesting that no one should be allowed to own more than a half a square mile, so long as a single person needing land in the community remained destitute of it. Though the 19th century as a whole reflected what I would call a universalist spirit, Burr did let in at least one Unitarian, maybe for the sake of contrast. The first issue included a piece on our country by William Henry Furness, that in the middle of a 30-year ministry at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. In some ways it fit in well. In other ways it illustrated the difference between a characteristically Unitarian and a characteristically Universalist approach to social justice. While other contributors gave voice to populist resentments, Furness was serene and confident, even as he called for radical change. "We have much to be thankful for," he began, referring to the natural wonders of North America, to American freedom from European barbarism, and to the broad faith in man that lay at the foundation of our social structure. This was preamble to his abolitionist message. While other contributors tacked an anti-slavery message on to their denunciations of capital, Furness had nothing to say against capitalism, but presented the struggle against slavery as the great question of the day, coming among us like an archangel of God, wielding the flaming sword of the Spirit that shall pierce to the very marrow of our being. The abolition of slavery, Furness promised, would usher in the kingdom of God. And yet, Furness's commitment to abolition was also white-centered. He persistently looked at slavery from the privileged perspective of white people. The slave trade, he claimed, had been initiated by good men and true, who engaged in the trade of human flesh without one misgiving. A bit later, they had some misgivings, but those were motivated by capitalism. Slavery was found, he said, to be a wasteful and ruinous business. Furness cited the anti-slavery passages in the Declaration of Independence as evidence of these misgivings, but noted that Americans, by whom he meant white Americans, continued to stand, quote, in utter dismay with folded hands, while the number of slaves in the land has increased by millions. And this brings him to his climactic moment. At last, one solitary voice spoke out and declared that the holding of men as property is a wrong, a sin before God, a violation of his will and law, and as such the slaveholder must cease from it instantly. This passage is clearly a reference to the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Now, personally, I am a big fan of William Lloyd Garrison. He was a brilliant agitator who used the ideas that Furness highlights here, that slavery is a sin and as such must be abolished immediately, to prick the consciences of white people and especially of Unitarian Bostonians. Garrison deserves much credit, but notice who Furness leaves out of this story. Black slave rebels like Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, who fought for their people's freedom. Black community leaders like Prince Hall and Richard Allen, who built churches dedicated to freedom. Black orators like Mariah Stewart and Frederick Douglass. His own congregant, Frances Harper, in her contributions to education, though she may well have joined his church after he wrote this article. The result is the typically Unitarian version of history, in which privileged white benevolence is conflated with the Spirit of God. Now we get to the wild part of this talk. Burr also published several pieces by the sensational novelist George Lepard, perhaps the strangest person ever to attend this congregation, or even any Universalist congregation at all. How many of you already know about George Lepard? Okay, very good, excellent. If you are a member of this congregation and have never heard of Lepard, you might want to incorporate into your summer reading such titles as The Quaker City, or The Monks of Monk Hall, or, my personal favorite, New York, its upper 10 and lower million. Lepard was a prophet of working class indignation and lurid conspiracy theories about how the workers of America were being betrayed by a weird mix of plutocrats, sorcerers, and sexually abusive clergymen. Fair warning, if you do decide to read Lepard's novels, you may sometimes feel you have fallen into the latest QAnon chat list. You may be feeling that way for the next 15 minutes, actually. Yet, Lepard's politics were consistently left-wing. Though he saw the world from the perspective of white male working class anger, his anti-capitalist anger also included fierce denunciations of slavery, of the theft of indigenous land, and of male violence against women. When I read Lepard, I find myself wondering, Where are our left-wing populists today? Might it have something to do with the way we, as Unitarian Universalists, have done more to keep the Unitarian than the Universalist side of our heritage alive? Lepard published many pieces in the 19th century, and it would take all day to tell you about all of them. So I'll focus on one piece in which he wrestled with what I have been calling backsliding. This piece was called The Carpenter's Son because one passage tells how Jesus achieved his full divinity while laboring in Joseph's workshop and reflecting on the gathered infamy suffered by his brothers and sisters, the poor. But his story is mostly about a secret gathering of Rosicrucians. Now, if you're not up on Western esotericism and occultism, you might not have heard of the Rosicrucians. They were, or perhaps are, supposedly a secret society of spiritual adepts who preserved the wisdom of ancient Egypt and promised one another to work anonymously for the healing of humanity. The first text describing the Rosicrucian society may have been fictional, but they were popular among the 17th century German pietists who began migrating to Pennsylvania in response to William Penn's invitation. These same pietists included the first people to promote the idea of universal salvation in North America, as well as some of Lepard's ancestors. He was keen to keep the Rosicrucian ideal alive in the 19th century, and in fact, he founded a Rosicrucian-tinged labor union that would provide the template for the Knights of Labor, America's first nationwide union. In Lepard's imagination, the Rosicrucians were an early version of the United Nations, a Congress of Brotherhood, or Parliament of Love. Its members represented Germany, Spain, Italy, France, England, Ireland, Sweden, Denmark, Hungary, Turkey, India, and Arabia, along with, quote, a colonist fresh from the witchcraft murders of New England, an enslaved African, and a Native American survivor of genocide. We eventually learned that most of these men, they're all men, come from the downtrodden classes of their respective nations. Lepard depicted them gathered in a mountain cavern in Germany around 1648. Each offered a grim report of events in his own country. The War of Creed, said the German, had left the poor where it found them. He's talking about the 30 Years' War. France was reeling from religious wars. The Inquisition raged in Spain. The Irishman finds no words as he lay a blood-stained shamrock and broken harp upon a rock. The Englishman praised his countrymen for overthrowing the monarchy in their civil war, but lamented that in the subsequent quarrels about, quote, creeds and forms, the idea of brotherhood became a dumb and mangled thing beneath their bloody feet. As the representatives of the nations continued, wrote Lepard, they told a single story of kings everywhere, priests everywhere, and everywhere slaves. And yet, they all expressed shock when the representative of Africa told his story of, quote, petty kings on the soil of Africa, selling the flesh and blood of Africa to eternal bondage in a new world. The shock was because they expected America to be different. They expected, in the words of the Swede, that it is in the West that the light will reveal to us the perfect image of human brotherhood. And so they turned with curiosity for the testimony of the New Englander. He told them a story of backsliding. The Plymouth Fathers had been driven from the shores of England by the lash of persecution, yet they soon became persecutors and misogynists. Referring to the persecution of Quakers, this person says, I have seen that image which we love in a wife, reverence in a sister, adore in a mother, lash naked through the streets amid the jeers and prayers of cadaverous priests. The colonist added that he himself had been driven from the New World because he could not think that murder was any the less murder because it was done in the name of God. And finally, the Indian told his story of how his people, numerous as the leaves on the trees, had converted to the Christianity of a black-robed Catholic priest, only to be murdered by other Christians who only believed in the cross as it was written in a book and not carved in wood. All these stories together encapsulated Lepard's theory of history. On the one hand, the United States was destined to be the scene of the redemption of humanity. On the other, it was also the ultimate site of backsliding, forever reproducing the violence and oppression its founders hoped to transcend. This logic allowed Lepard to be fervently patriotic and caustically anti-American. It also allowed him to hold out a hope of redemption for the backsliders themselves. That vision plays out in a subsequent part of the story when a Rosicrucian leader speaks prophetically about the events that will befall the world over the next 2 centuries. That is, in the time between Lepard's fictional gathering and Lepard's own historical moment. The prophecy centers on individuals who embody the Rosicrucian spirit in different ways. First, an apostle will come from England to the New World, treat the Indians justly, and invite the oppressed of the earth to join his people in the wilderness. This is William Penn. Next, God will send a deliverer. Don't look at that slide yet. Next, God will send a deliverer to assert the sanctity of the new world from all kings. That's clearly George Washington. Through his work, America will become the young heart and the young brain of a decrepit earth. But when the spirit of brotherhood returns to Europe, things get more complicated. In France, the story is taken up by a Messiah of carnage, Robespierre, the text you see here, and then a crowned avenger, Napoleon. These complex instruments of divine destiny pave the way for an epoch of brotherhood among men, slated to begin either in 1848, when Lepard is writing, or perhaps in 1884. He learns to be not too precise in his prophecies. But, the Rosicrucian prophet continues, the glorious consummation of brotherhood will be preceded by the ultimate backsliding, the expansion of slavery in democratic America. Rich men in America will strengthen the chains by which millions of the black race are held in bondage. They will regard these millions of the black race as beasts of the field and herd them together in profitable incest, selling the fruit of the mother's womb before it has seen the light, and holding property in human flesh and human blood in immortal souls. As the reader by now knows to expect, the Rosicrucians groan in response. This in America? This in the New World? But their leader explains that in order that man may know the value of freedom, it is necessary that he should first suffer the pains of hell in the ditch of slavery. Like the Unitarian Reverend Furness, Lepard's prophet anticipates that the end of slavery will usher in the kingdom of God. But he has a very different notion of how this will come about. Furness assumed that benevolent whites like William Lloyd Garrison would end slavery. The Rosicrucian says it will end when, quote, the black slaves in America, the white slaves in Ireland, in fact, the slaves all over the world, will rise upon their masters in a jubilee of brute force. In some ways, this anticipation was less problematic than Furness's. While Furness kept white people at the center of the story, Lepard recognized that true liberation ordinarily involves the initiative and action of the oppressed. But even as he celebrated slave rebellion, he perpetuated stereotypes about it. Because the masters had refused to educate the slaves, he said, they would be punished by the violence of brutes in human form, who would vent their hellish fury not only on the rich man, but the beautiful wife who nestles in his arms and the little child who clings to his knees. Lepard made it clear that this would be God's work, but he couldn't quite imagine God's enslaved workers as fully human. The limitations of his imagination were also evident in the concluding scene, in which the Rosicrucians elect a new supreme chief. Their election is by lot, with potential candidates being eliminated one at a time. Isaac the slave is next to last to be eliminated. Clearly, Lepard wanted his mostly white readers to reflect on a possibility that a member of that, quote, thrice degraded race might rise to the highest position of honor. Ultimately, though, The lot falls to the prophet who had predicted the careers of Penn, Washington, Robespierre, and Napoleon. Throughout the story, Lepard takes care to obscure the race of this man. He describes him as dark-skinned, but also as sunburned. He says that few could guess his country or his race, but also says he might be from a Mediterranean island. The one important thing about him is his class. He's again and again called a peasant, and Lepard calls attention to his simple clothing and the marks of toil on his body. And Lepard describes the whole election process from the point of view of this peasant. He has intense emotions. When the black man is drawing his lot, the peasant feels a cold shudder of jealousy. Just before he draws his own lot, he feels intense ambition. His blood becomes fire with a boundless joy. Then he has a panic attack and makes somebody else read the card for him. Eventually, the Black Rosicrucian reads out these words. It is from the child of toil that the children of toil must look for their redemption. The peasant then reveals himself to be the son of an Arab who was cast ashore in Corsica, married a local woman after being enslaved by the local lord, whose name he took on, Bonaparte. So this hint that the leader of the Rosicrucians is also the ancestor of Napoleon is interesting because, as we've seen, he did not have a wholly positive view of Napoleon. But he did have a capacious enough view of God to imagine that even a crowned avenger like Napoleon could be used by divine providence to bring an end to monarchy. All of this, everything I've been describing, is classic Lepard. In all his writings, he managed to be radically intersectional, attentive to oppression based on race, class, gender, and nationality, and also to put angry young men with a penchant for violence at the very center of every story. Angry young men just like himself. These young men simultaneously get to be the instruments of divine vengeance and the embodiments of Christ-like love. Now, most angry young white men get to be older and wiser. Lepard didn't. He died just 6 years after writing the story at age 31, still churning out sensational fiction, including a magazine story denouncing the fugitive slave law. His friend Charles Chauncey Burr lived a good bit longer, and his subsequent career offers a sobering warning about what can happen to Lepard-style populism. In 1848, he had edited The 19th Century, a magazine whose title expressed optimism about the coming age of freedom. In 1851, he married Celia Burley, who became the first woman ordained by the Unitarians. They divorced 2 years later. By 1863, Burr is editing The Old Guard, a reactionary publication devoted to the pro-Confederate wing of the Northern Democratic Party, the Copperheads. Burr aligned himself with New York Mayor Godfrey Gunther, who warned that the Civil War would result in annihilation of the white man for the Negro. So you can see from these quotes, the Old Guard's stock in trade was race baiting. When Burr attacked Abraham Lincoln, he did so by portraying him as half-black. After Lincoln's death, Burr went after the radical Republicans in Congress, such as the Unitarian Charles Sumner, by portraying them simultaneously as mongrels and as capitalist elites. At the same time, Burr continued to cast himself as a champion of the people and the poor. The war, he said, was prosecuted by abolitionists and thieves. Lincoln's war debts, Burr predicted, would bankrupt ordinary Americans and enrich bankers. In many ways, this is a complete political turnaround. We should not assume that Burr's evolution was inevitable. We certainly should not assume that had George Lepard lived longer, that he would have morphed from an angry young radical into an angry old reactionary. But Burr's transformation does represent one possible pathway for the populist impulse. It's not hard to see the seeds of Burr's reactionary populism in Lepard's radical populism. Indeed, it's not hard to see the seeds of QAnon. The fascination with secret societies and secret saviors emerging from those societies, the penchant for violent drama. But I don't mean to suggest that we should shun populism and embrace Unitarian-style progressivism instead. For one thing, populism has a strong capacity to mobilize large groups of people. And for another, progressivism has its own downsides. Just as populism can become working-class white resentment, progressivism can become a sort of know-it-all elitism that claims sole authority to decide which oppressed groups to recognize and which to ignore. It's no coincidence that Burr's bitterest political enemy, Charles Sumner, was a Harvard-educated Unitarian who was close friends with Unitarian abolitionists who were still living off of the wealth of their slave-trading ancestors. It's no coincidence today that right-wing populists direct some of their harshest rhetoric against Ivy Leaguers, even as black, brown, and poor people suffer the consequences of their policies. And I think it may be instructive that Burr had left Universalism far behind by the time he became editor of the Old Guard. Universalism, thank goodness, has rarely been a vehicle for right-wing populism. I will admit that it almost became a vehicle at my own congregation just after World War I, when the congregants tossed out their socialist minister, Clarence Skinner, and chose Klansman Charles Clark as their minister instead. Fortunately for our congregation, Clark did not last much longer than Skinner had. At its best, Universalism has blended populist fervor with inclusive love. That's what happened here in 1848. This was a place where angry young men could connect their anger to a vision of social change that included everyone. But, once again, Universalism has not always been at its best. Much more frequently, it's been a way station on the road to Unitarianism. Working-class radicals joined Universalist congregations, accumulated social capital, sent their children to college and into the professional class. By the time the Unitarians and Universalists merged, both movements were far more progressive than populist in their approaches to social change. My guess is that this was so at this congregation, though I'm eager to learn more about that part of your story. This came at a serious cost because by the time of Unitarian Universalist merger, neither the Universalists nor anyone else was keeping inclusive populism alive in the United States. In the past few years, we've seen what a lack of inclusive populism means for American politics. Perhaps one task of our Universalist Convocation is to bring the spirit of inclusive populism that was so much a part of Universalist history back. If we want to bring it back, we need to think about the connection between populist anger and love. In the climactic scene of Bonaparte's story, the peasant Bonaparte, still brimming with anger at the lords who enslaved him, is asked to embody the story of Jesus. The story, he explains, exemplifies the principle of brotherhood in the life of a worker, toiling with the workers of the human race, the son of the poor, living and dying for the poor. The carpenter's son, separate from all creeds, could speak to Muslims who already viewed him as a prophet, to Hindus who affirmed a sublime manifestation of God in the flesh, to deists who saw God in the leaf and flower, and even to atheists whose hearts beat warmly for the good of man. Even Burr, at his best, was also a champion of love. "I've looked out," he wrote in the 19th century, "upon the bewildered, quarreling, unhappy throng of men, and sent up many a wish that in some way they might be made to love each other." I said earlier that the Unitarian path to reparations begins with a recognition of how much we have benefited from the suffering of others, while the Universalist path to solidarity begins when we connect our own suffering to the suffering of others. That second connection is possible only if the anger we feel is held by a larger love. Without love, solidarity is impossible because anger can consume us. That consuming is what we see in the style, but not the substance, of Lepard's writings. And it's what we see more fully in Burr's Copperhead Resentment. So the question is, how do we find a love that is large enough to hold our anger and channel it as a powerful source of energy and commitment? And how do we find a love that is large enough to hold our backsliding and call even the likes of Charles Chauncey Burr back into beloved community? 3 years ago, when the 2020 General Assembly created the Article 2 Study Commission, it gave that commission a clear mandate. Whatever new language we might choose to express our principles and purposes, it would need to have love at the center. The commission has been 100% faithful to that mandate, even to the point of creating a graphic representation of our values that literally has love at the center. In so doing, they have bequeathed the theological task to the next generation of UUs. What do we mean when we talk about love? I suspect many of us assume that when we put love at the center, we're finally doing honor to the Universalist side of our family tree. I assumed that several years ago when I set out to compare the love language of Unitarians and Universalists who appeared in the documentary History of Unitarian Universalism. Since I was the editor of that documentary history, I had ready access to keyword searchable versions of all the texts, so I could quickly compare the way Unitarians talked about love, the way Universalists did. I expected Universalists would do most of the talking about love, and that's not quite what I found. What I found was they talked about it the same as much, but in very different ways. Unitarians typically talked about the human duty to love God and other human beings. Way back in 1831, Henry Ware Jr. sought to inculcate in his readers a warm, glowing feeling of preference and desire, a feeling which attaches itself in love to the Father of all and to all good beings. Nearly a century later, in A World Away, Hajjam Kisser Singh, founder of Kasi Unitarianism, stressed the human duty to love, to obey, and to fear and reverence God, and to love our fellow humans. To the eve of consolidation, love to God and love to man was the most common summary of Unitarian belief and ethics. Universalists, by contrast, put the accent on God's love for human beings and for the world. Across the theological spectrum, here come the clues, from Gerard Winstanley to George de Benneville to Hosea Ballou to Olympia Brown to Quillen Shin to Clarence Skinner, the affirmation was the same. God is love, love is God, divine love triumphs over everything. God is love itself, wrote Gerard Winstanley in the first Universalist text written in English. George de Benneville referred to God as my Lord and my love. Hosea Ballou insisted that God's attitude towards humanity is love from beginning to end. Lucy Barnes began by insisting that the scriptures declare that God is love. Thomas Whittemore called the love of God a soul-inspiring theme sure to make Universalists happy. Quillen Shin noted that Universalism affirms a perfect God who is perfectly good, he is love, he is perfect love, and that the force behind all forces in all worlds is love. Clarence Skinner, in many respects quite different from Shin, echoed Shin when he asserted that the Universalist idea of God is that of a universal, impartial, immanent spirit whose nature is love. This is the largest thought the world has ever known. Reflecting on recent scientific discoveries near the end of her life, Olympia Brown affirmed that earth and air are filled with proofs of divine love. You might think the contrast I'm making is between Unitarian humanism and Universalist theism, but that's not it at all. Unitarian theists still talk mostly about the human duty to love God, and it's possible to talk about love in a Universalist way without using God language, instead talking about cosmic love, or love as the basic principle of reality. At the time of consolidation, two prominent Universalists, one for it and one against it, raised a prophetic concern that the distinctly Universalist view of love was at risk of being forgotten. These were Albert Perry, leader of the anti-merger campaign, and Gordon McKeman, who later became president of Starr King, a school with Unitarian roots. In his article, Gordon McKeman summarized Universalist theology as ultimate confidence in cosmic love as a metaphysic and human love as an ethic. McKeman contrasted this with the rational method that was by then the defining feature of the Unitarian tradition and of liberalism more generally. Since most Universalists, since Hosea Ballou, had embraced the rational method, it was easy to imagine that it could be the common ground that would bind the two traditions together. But the cost, McKeman warned, was that Universalism as it was, the institutional expression of ultimate confidence, can disappear. In an article on the uniqueness of Universalism, Albert Perry made the same warning in stronger terms. "We believe in love," he wrote, "cosmic love as the creative force and human divine love as the law of life," adding that the innate and historic mission of the Church is to inspire love rather than to dispense truth. Perry used the phrase inclusive optimism to describe this, and on this basis claimed that Universalists will logically concern themselves with peace before justice, with human values rather than institutionalized society, with tolerance rather than right, with individual fulfillment rather than social change. And he nodded to Universalism's populist affinities by asserting that Universalists are majority-minded, while Unitarians prefer churches that are instruments of a disciplined or defined minority. Perhaps conscious that people like Charles Chauncey Burr would not fare well in Unitarian Universalism, Perry even lamented that well-meaning enthusiasm for equal rights can lead to what he called un-universalist condemnations of white supremacists. Now, on that point, I need to offer a small historical quibble. It is not un-universalist to condemn white supremacists. George Lepard and the younger version of Charles Chauncey Burr could condemn white supremacists with the best of them. They condemned slave owners, capitalists, college professors like me, denominational preachers like some of you, with much stronger language than Perry was thinking about. But Lepard especially saved his strongest condemnations for those who suggested that anyone, even the slave owner, even the black backslider, even the very, very angry young man, was beyond the reach of God's love. That's what made him a Universalist. Not a refusal to condemn, but an openness to some power in the universe large enough to hold the condemner and the condemned in a common embrace. That's the openness that Albert Perry found missing in the statement of purpose included in the original UUA Constitution, the very first iteration of Article 2. That text includes the characteristically Unitarian phrasing, love to God and love to man. A bit too generously, Perry described this as a compromise between the traditional statements of the two denominations. It was really the Unitarian statement. But then he let loose. In place of the affirmation that proclaimed that love was divine or that God was love, and that this force was unconquerable, we have an exhortation to love God and man, whatever we expect the results to be. In place of an affirmation that goodwill and sacrificial service will progressively overcome all evil, we are urged to cooperate with those who have goodwill towards us. This, I would proclaim, is the least idealistic statement ever made by an organized religious movement. A complete and abject surrender of a great and creative faith. Now, I mostly agree with what Perry is saying here, but I draw the opposite conclusion. For him, the surrender of the Universalist version of love was a reason to reject merging. For me, it's a reason to stay in our merged movement and keep fighting to renew the Universalist spirit. It's because I think we need to think about love in both ways, both as an ethical obligation to love one another and as a cosmic reality that holds us even when we fail to do so. The Unitarian view of love has given us an indispensable tool of accountability. When we fail to act out of love, something is wrong. When we try to act out of love but instead produce harmful consequences, something is wrong. Even when we, through no direct fault of our own, benefit from the unloving actions of other people, something is wrong. All of these are occasions for the work of reparation. But reparation works best when the person who's done the harm or benefited from the harm recognizes that this is the case. And all too often, this is not the case. When we cause harm to one another, we are so often conscious of our good intentions that we can't see the impact of our actions. Or we may feel justifiably that we too have been harmed and nobody is paying attention to our harms. We may find ourselves in the place of George Lepard, seeing everything through the lens of our personal experience, or the place of Charles Chauncey Burr, and turn bitterly against the progressive do-gooders who are quick to acknowledge other harms but silent about what we have suffered. If we want to hold and transform the Lepards and the Burrs, we need something bigger than Unitarian love. We need Universalist love. We need a love that gives us a tool of inclusion. Whether we love or fail to love, and even when we are at our most unlovable, there is still more love that we can lean into. This larger love calls us again and again to welcome back the backsliders. It's what makes solidarity possible. So, in conclusion, does the recently proposed revision of Article 2 give us both a Unitarian and a Universalist theology of love? Here's a bit of what this year's General Assembly will be asked to embrace. The purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. I'll be honest, this doesn't say everything I wish it would say. It says that love is the power that holds us together, but it doesn't say whether this is just the love that we ourselves express, or first and foremost, the love that's held us since the day we were born. I like the fact that love is capitalized. I like the phrase liberating love. I wish I knew whether it was the love that liberates us, as well as the love that helps us do our own liberating. There's a lot that I'd like to talk about more, but at the end of the day, this is love language that says more, this is language that says more about love than either the 1960 or the 1985 version of Article 2. This language suggests that we are moving towards a fuller embrace of our Universalist legacy. And I take hope from the fact that no bylaw language can have the last word in theology. It's our work to make it real. As Unitarian Universalists, we remain heirs to what Clarence Skinner called the largest thought the world has ever known. So let's work together to bring it back ever more fully into our shared life. Thank you. Yes, I hope I'd have more time, but I'll take the time that I have. Yes.
I'm glad Al Perry was the guy who converted me to Universalism in Providence Church.
Oh. You need the mic.
So I'm glad it was Al Perry who converted me to Universalism from just Unitarianism. I became both at that point. And he was the minister at the church in Providence, Rhode Island, the Universalist Church. And our humanist meeting met there, and that's how I was acquainted with the church. I was going to the one in, Newport, Rhode Island. But it was too conservative for me, and so
Sandy,
I converted
do you have a question?
and started going there.
Sandy, do you have a question for him?
Yes, I just wondered, did you know him personally?
No, so I'm thrilled to meet somebody who did. You're the first person I've met who knew him personally.
Oh, okay. Well, let's talk later.
Okay. No, I just discovered him reading through the Universalist Leader in the run-up to merger.
He had some wonderful answers to things.
I'm glad you brought up George Lepard. A lot of people don't understand how young he was. Could you talk about that and about what age did he start espousing his ideas and what age did he really, become sort of ultra radical, I would say?
Yeah, so I've read a good bit of Lepard. I haven't read everything. He was just amazingly prolific, partly because he constantly rehashed his stuff. So a lot of what I was reading from the 19th century is also in this novel called Paul Ardenheim. I guess my understanding is he was kind of full-blown radical from the beginning, although, so Quaker City is his first big splash, and this is the city that tells about the evil plutocrats and sorcerers running Philadelphia. And, I don't think he had the same kind of quasi-Marxist anti-capitalism in the Quaker City that he had in the later stuff. I mean, it was partly because of, the bubbling up of actual Marxist movements and Fourierist socialist movements during this time. Yeah, I wish I could say more.
And just one other thing. He lived in Germantown in this neighborhood.
Yeah. And this is something that I think is really interesting, that the congregation's 1937 location is closer to where Lepard lived than the location it was in when he was hanging out. So that was interesting. And Burr actually celebrated Lepard's wedding not in the church building, but on the shores of the Wissahickon, because Lepard had this. I didn't have time to talk about this, but he had this very intense mystical connection to the Wissahickon.
All right, I think this is when we were going to have some lunch, but I'm sure Dan would be happy to answer other questions that people have in more informal format. So we'll have some lunch downstairs now and come back. Oh, then we'll have the group photo at 1:15. So if
where will the group photo be?
Down in Fellowship Hall, right after we've had a chance to have some lunch, and then we'll be back up here at 1:30. So, see you. Yes, let's give another appreciation to Dan.
Friends, by way of blessing of the food, we're going to send you off with another song. If you notice one, you can join in as you head outside or downstairs to Fellowship Hall.
There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more love somewhere. One more time. There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more love somewhere.
Thanks, friends. Have a good lunch. Oh, yeah, thank you, Sandy. If you need the lifts downstairs, Sandy can show you how it works. It is not an elevator, we are reminded to tell you, but it does take you where you need to go if you need the accessible lift.
Yeah, right.